Hi everyone, I just finished the most recent Zelda game, the rhythm-based Cadence of Hyrule Crypt of the Necrodancer featuring the Legend of Zelda, and I thought it would be fun to explore the possibility that this game might actually fit on the official Zelda timeline. After a thorough analysis, I believe it belongs in the Downfall timeline after the era of Light and Dark, during the Golden Era. Specifically, I think Cadence of Hyrule occurs after the events of A Link Between Worlds and Triforce Heroes, but before the original Zelda game, which takes place in the era of Decline. If you are familiar with the Zelda timeline, wherein each Zelda game is placed in chronological order in relation to each other, you know that it is subject to endless debates and analyses. But you also know that crossover and spin-off Zelda games are considered non-canonical, and they don't get a place on the Zelda timeline. And Cadence of Hyrule is certainly a crossover with the Crypt of the Necrodancer series. But, just for kicks, let's assume that it is canonical and that it will get a placement on the official timeline. Let's dive right in. First, I'm going to remove the adult timeline as a possibility. Cadence of Hyrule is wildly different from anything that occurs in that timeline. As I was analyzing the evidence, there was so little tying it to the adult timeline that I'm not even going to consider it an option. Also, I'm going to exclude Breath of the Wild from this analysis because its timeline placement has not been confirmed. Including it in this analysis would entail placing it on the Zelda timeline, and any attempt to do so in this video would be foolish. I hope you understand. From the get-go, Cadence of Hyrule feels like an old-school top-down 2D Zelda game, and most of those games are on the Downfall timeline. A great example is A Link to the Past. But then again, the Minish Cap has this same feel, and it occurs prior to the timeline split created by Ocarina of Time. And so does Four Swords Adventures, to a degree, and that game is in the child timeline. So while it mostly feels like a Downfall game, that isn't going to be enough. So let's take a look at the Cadence of Hyrule enemies that have only occurred in one timeline thus far. In Cadence of Hyrule, there are mage enemies in the form of Stalfos mages. These are clearly a reference to the mages from Four Swords Adventures. To date, these characters have only occurred in the child timeline in Four Swords Adventures. But there are two problems. The first is that the mages in Four Swords Adventures are not true enemies, they are characters. And second, these Stalfos mages are essentially skeletons wearing the mage garb minus the crystal ball, making them quite distinct from each other. And then there are 4 enemies in Cadence of Hyrule that only exist in the Downfall timeline. Those are Beeries, Daras, Landmoles, and Lynels. I have no idea how to pronounce most of those. Anyone who watched the Game Theorist video on the Zelda timeline might find that interesting as they use a similar analysis to explore Breath of the Wild's placement. Let's move on to the Overworld. This might seem like an insane proposition considering much of the Overworld map of Cadence of Hyrule is randomly generated. The map is separated into various regions whose locations within the Overworld are determined when a new profile is started such that each player's experience is unique. But I actually ran a bunch of tests to see if any of the locations remain constant. I restarted game slots over and over, each time running all around Hyrule, unlocking every part of the map. Lo and behold, there are 5 things that are always true no matter what map your game generates. Number 1 is that Hyrule Castle is somewhere always in the middle of the map. It's surrounded by a moat of water with a bridge crossing the moat on the south side of the castle. This leads us to number 2. The moat is part of a river which always flows south, and it flows through number 3 on our list, Lake Hylia. The lake is always south of the castle on the river originating from the moat, but the river does not end with the lake as it does in games like A Link to the Past and A Link Between Worlds. It flows through the lake and terminates into an ocean. Number 4 is the ocean and beach, which both always take up some portion of the southern boundary while often wrapping around to the east or west sides. Number 5 on the list is Death Mountain. This region always touches the northern boundary. Not only that, the locations within many of the regions are fixed. For instance, within Lake Hylia, you will always have the frozen grotto on the left, and this bridge on the right. This evil Zora here waiting to shoot fireballs at you, and these friendly Zoras here. On Death Mountain, there is always the Temple of Storms right here. This section with the water source reminiscent of the Zora Falls from A Link to the Past or Zoras Domain from A Link Between Worlds. And then this bridge, which reminds me of this bridge from A Link to the Past and this one from A Link Between Worlds. You probably know that Hyrule is constantly shifting around, and it can drastically change from game to game. But a couple of games in the Downfall timeline share many common traits. Two officially licensed Zelda books by Dark Horse Comics titled The Legend of Zelda Hyrule Historia and Encyclopedia attempt to illustrate these similarities across the games. They show the maps for A Link to the Past and A Link Between Worlds being almost identical, with Death Mountain in the north, Hyrule Castle in the center, a water source in the northeast that flows into a river which in turn creates the castle's moat, and finally that river ending in Lake Hylia to the southeast of the castle. Note there is no ocean or beach along the southern border. Interestingly enough, the map of the original Legend of Zelda game fits in the northern portion of those first two maps, but Lake Hylia has migrated significantly northwest, possibly submerging what's left of the castle under the lake in that era. At the same time, the previously unseen ocean water has risen substantially and covered half of Hyrule, with the beach creating the southeasternmost border of the original Zelda game. That ocean and beach are nowhere to be found in A Link to the Past, nor A Link Between Worlds. And the original Zelda in turn is actually what's known as Lesser Hyrule, and it takes up just one tiny little corner of the entire overworld map of Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. In that map, you can actually see Lake Hylia, the cemetery, the ocean beach, and Spectacle Rock, as they all sit beneath Death Mountain in the original game. Okay, so keeping all of this in mind, consider what a map would look like in the era between when Hyrule looks like what it does in A Link Between Worlds, and what it looks like in the original Zelda game. It might look like this: Hyrule Castle in the center, and Death Mountain in the north. The water around the castle still forms a river that flows through Lake Hylia, but notice how much closer Lake Hylia is to Hyrule Castle, almost like it is migrating north, possibly going to overtake the castle by the era of Legend of Zelda. And the river no longer terminates into the lake, but flows into the ocean, which in turn creates a southern beach border, as if the ocean has also moved north. What about that frozen portion taking up half of Lake Hylia? Its placement is similar to Frozen Hyrule from Four Swords Adventures. Could these two locations be related? Well, I watched a bunch of FSA game footage, and it turns out Frozen Hyrule is actually the result of Vati's curse in that game. The enemies in the temple are not ice-themed, they are brainwashed knights of the kingdom. And in the final cutscene of the game, after Link has defeated Vati, it actually shows Frozen Hyrule thawed out. And no, when that ice thaws, it doesn't create a new body of water. I checked the cutscene. This means that if Cadence takes place before or after the events of Four Swords Adventures, that section of the map would not necessarily be frozen, because it is the result of a curse that would not exist in those eras. Also notice that Lake Hylia is northeast of the castle, nowhere near its Cadence of Hyrule placement. In A Link to the Past, the Dark World counterpart to Lake Hylia is Ice Lake. But it wouldn't really make sense that the two locations merged, because Link's wish at the end of A Link to the Past would probably prevent this. All of this is to say that I think Cadence of Hyrule's Frozen Grotto is not carried over from another era. I think it is one of the many results of Octavo's curse, and my guess is it wasn't actually frozen prior to the events of the game. But again, Zelda maps are always tricky, and they are the focal point of countless timeline debates. This has led many theorists, including myself, to typically discount geography-based debates. But I may be finally turning the corner here because there is much more convincing evidence in this map. Remember the water source in the northeast? That source has been there since the original Zelda game, but back then they didn't really name all the locations. In A Link to the Past, that water source is known as Zora Falls, Many years later, in A Link Between Worlds, this area was changed to be called Zoras Domain. In Zora Falls, there is a friendly King Zora who will sell you flippers so that you can swim. In Zoras Domain, in A Link Between Worlds, it is a friendly Queen Zora who gives you the flippers. In Cadence of Hyrule, it is the Zora Prince who gives you guessed it, the flippers. So all three games have Zora royalty giving Link the same item, the flippers. And the friendly Zora Prince is rendered in a similar art style as the Queen Auron in A Link Between Worlds. Could the Prince in Cadence of Hyrule be the son of the Queen in A Link Between Worlds? Are all these flippers giving friendly royal Zoras all related? Remember that Zoras live hundreds of years, and this would explain why the family exists across eras. But in Cadence of Hyrule, the prince is not located in that northeast water source section that the king and queen resided in. He is actually in the frozen section of Lake Hylia. This brings me to my next point. Mysteriously, every map I played generated 2 frames that contain a tattered flag bearing the Zora emblem on top of a hill or pile of rocks. Despite the presence of the flags, there are no Zoras here. It's almost like they are the ruins of an old dwelling. And in about half of the game maps I experienced, one of these flagged ruins was in the cliffs around Death Mountain, right where you would expect Zora's Domain to be, near Hyrule's water source, just as it was in A Link to the Past and A Link Between Worlds. I think the flags are meant to represent the decline of Zora's Domain, where the Zora Prince's family once dwelt, but they abandoned it for some reason. One likely possibility is that the friendly Zora are migrating south towards the sea. The friendly Zora in Cadence of Hyrule have quite the obsession with surfing, which is usually an ocean activity, as evidenced by their surfboards all over the beach and Lake Hylia. I think Cadence of Hyrule not only shows us how Zora's bodies of water evolved, but how it impacted the Zora's way of life. They abandoned their domain at the water source near Death Mountain. The evil Zoras stayed in Hyrule and continue to inhabit the rivers, while the good royal Zora have given up on trying to rule over and reconcile both factions of Zora, so they just surfed away into the sea, never to be seen again in the Downfall timeline. Allow me to explain. In a few Zelda games, there has existed the presence of good and bad Zoras simultaneously. The Zelda Encyclopedia book attempts to explain this on page 49 by stating the following. By the era of A Link to the Past, the kingdom of Hyrule is in decline, and relations with the Zora have soured greatly. Their bodies change from blue to green, and they become increasingly aggressive toward outsiders, going as far to spit fireballs at anyone who dares to tread near their waters. This explains why the Zora are friendly in Ocarina of Time, but in the subsequent game in the Downfall timeline, A Link to the Past, most of the Zora are evil and will shoot fireballs at Link, with the exception being the king who appears benign and sells Link the flippers. I should note there are Zora-like creatures in A Link to the Past's Dark World called Ku, who are very similar to Zora, but they have one eye and they are blue. The dual Zora trend persists in the Downfall timeline with Link's Awakening, the Oracle games, and A Link Between Worlds. The Oracle games solidify the fact that evil Zora live in rivers and the good ones prefer the sea. Then A Link Between Worlds takes it to another level. Here's an excerpt from the Zelda Encyclopedia book to explain. In A Link Between Worlds, Queen Auron attempts to rule over the Zora, but they split, with half pledging loyalty to her and half rebelling in violent fashion. Despite the Queen's attempts to return the Zora to their former glory, this hostile faction of Zora grows stronger over time, and by the era of the adventure of Link, the Zora are outright monsters. As I already mentioned, Cadence of Hyrule follows this same split with the green Zora Prince ruling over the benevolent surfboarding Sea Zora, while the evil River Zora will shoot fireballs at you. Not only that, but the reason the prince gives you the flippers is that you save him from these strange ghosts that look like evil Zora. Perhaps this is a callback to the conflict first established in A Link Between Worlds. We also need to explore the Zoras in Four Swords Adventures, because it also contains good and evil Zoras. At first, this seems to contradict FSA's placement on the child timeline after Twilight Princess, where the Zora are only good. But upon closer inspection, all the evil Zoras are blue with one eye, similar to the Ku from A Link to the Past. So either they are a completely different species than those seen in Twilight Princess, or they are good Zoras who have been cursed by Vati's spell, much like the Knights of Hyrule, who obviously would normally be on Link's side. All that is to say that I don't think the evil Zora in Cadence of Hyrule are a lineage of those in Four Swords Adventures. If Cadence takes place after FSA, this would necessitate the Twilight Princess Zoras becoming evil, then evolving to have one eye in FSA, then evolving back to having two eyes in Cadence. This seems unlikely. If Cadence occurs before FSA, although it would probably solve the eye problem, and possibly provide a smoother transition for the good versus evil thing, it would create new problems, including the evolution of the Gorons. Let's take a look at that next. Cadence of Hyrule is severely lacking in Gorons, and this is a telltale sign of the downfall timeline. Across the timeline, the only time we see Gorons are in the Oracle games, which don't even take place in Hyrule. Apparently they left town for Holodrum and Labrina, probably to avoid the terror of Ganon. Within the map of Cadence, there is exactly one square with evidence of Gorons, and that is the Bomb Shop, which will get randomly placed on the map depending on your playthrough. Bombs and Gorons have a long history in Zelda games, and the merchant certainly has many Goron characteristics, except for the strange volcano on their head that is constantly erupting. We've never seen a Goron with this trait. The merchant mentions that only Gorons can eat the bombs he's selling, but it is clear he hasn't seen any Gorons either. The bomb shop does have two flags bearing the Goron emblem, but the shop is not fixed in the traditional home of the Gorons, Death Mountain. To me, that is meant to show the last remnants of Gorons in this timeline before they disappear altogether. They have left Hyrule, and what is left of them has evolved into strange volcano-headed creatures. They probably continue to evolve into something unrecognizable in the era of the original game. So combining this with what we know about the Zoras, if Cadence takes place before Four Swords Adventures, this would mean that the Gorons in Twilight Princess would evolve into this rare volcano-headed Goron, then back to normal abundant Gorons in Four Swords Adventures. This seems less likely than the idea that this lone creature is some kind of traveling, evolved Goron merchant within the Downfall timeline, never to be seen in the Downfall timeline again. The last race I want to examine is the Sheikah tribe. These silver-haired warriors have been fighting for the royal family since time immemorial. The most famous Sheikah, Impa, makes an appearance as her younger self in Cadence of Hyrule. Assuming Impaz and Madame Fanati in Twilight Princess don't count, Impa has only appeared in the Downfall games post-timeline split. The last time we see her in the Downfall timeline is via references in the opening scroll of The Adventure of Link, as well as that game's manual. She also appears in the game manual of the original Legend of Zelda. She is an elderly woman in both games. It is interesting that the era prior to those two games, when A Link Between Worlds occurs, has an Impa, and that Impa actually becomes a sage. Some might say that her becoming a sage in A Link Between Worlds gives her unnaturally long life, and this enables her to live until the era of The Legend of Zelda and The Adventure of Link. But sages actually have a history of remaining in other realms once they become sages. And the last time we see her in A Link Between Worlds, she is working her magic in the Sacred Realm with the other newly awakened sages. I think she stayed there, meaning that the elderly woman we see in the original games is not the one from A Link Between Worlds, but a reincarnation of her. So then, with all of that in mind, if Cadence of Hyrule takes place in the era between A Link Between Worlds and The Legend of Zelda, it could be the case that this young Impa grew old into this elderly Impa from the original games. But there are more Sheikah in Cadence of Hyrule, and they are important to this analysis. They take the form of fortune tellers, a role that we have seen Sheikah take in another Zelda game, Twilight Princess. Notice the silver hair and all the Sheikah symbology. But what is interesting about these Sheikah is that they appear to be skilled in making garments. All three of them are creating some sort of garment from yarn or thread. And each one tells Link that Octavo stole their magic threads, one for courage, one for wisdom, and one for power. Octavo creates the golden lute from these threads in an effort to enchant the game's enemies so he can build an army to fight Ganon. We never find out what the garments these Sheikah are crafting, but their choice of vocation is certainly odd. Why garment makers in a game where the central device is music and not clothes? Well, one explanation may come from the Zelda game Triforce Heroes. That game takes place directly after Link Between Worlds, and the main villain, Lady Maud, and her sister, Madame Couture, both hail from a tribe who specialize in crafting magical clothes. And while that game takes place in the land of Hytopia, the Zelda Encyclopedia explains it may be close to Hyrule, given how fashionable everyone dresses in the adventure of Link. So these magical garb-creating Sheikah in Cadence of Hyrule probably hail from the same magical tribe we learned about in Triforce Heroes. Let's take a look at some of the items in Cadence of Hyrule, as many of them are exclusive to certain timelines. Again, I will be excluding Breath of the Wild from this analysis. There is the Ice Rod, which has only occurred in the Downfall timeline via A Link to the Past and A Link Between Worlds. There's the Deku Leaf, which has only appeared in the adult timeline via Wind Waker. There's the Cane of Samaria, which has only appeared in the Downfall timeline via A Link to the Past and Oracle of Ages. There's the Power Glove, which has only appeared in the Downfall timeline via A Link to the Past, Oracle of Ages, A Link Between Worlds, and The Adventure of Link. Then there are a couple of items that have only occurred in other Zelda spin-off and crossover games. But as I said, those aren't considered canon, so let's ignore those. So once again, the Downfall timeline has it. Of the items in Cadence of Hyrule which have thus far only occurred in one timeline, with the exception of the Deku Leaf, all have occurred in the Downfall timeline. Interestingly, the Master Sword appears to be missing. At least I have not been able to locate it, and I don't see anything online indicating otherwise. This is fitting though, because the Master Sword is last seen in A Link Between Worlds, never to return again in the Downfall timeline, not in The Legend of Zelda and not in The Adventure of Link. Cadence of Hyrule has very few cutscenes. In the game's first cutscene, Link is shown kneeling after presumably being knocked down by Octavo. Notice that he is holding the Hylian shield. This shield has occurred in many Zelda games, but interestingly, I don't believe you can actually obtain it in the game. I haven't found it, and I can't find anyone online who has either. And then, even more interestingly, Link is not wielding it in the final cutscene of the game. So he appears to possess it in the events prior to Cadence of Hyrule. It should also be noted that the Hylian shield's art style changes every time it appears in a new game. So that means, if we can identify which game's Hylian shield art style matches this cutscene, then we can determine which game occurs prior to Cadence of Hyrule. Well, after looking at every Hylian shield throughout the Legend of Zelda series, I can confidently tell you this is the same shield from A Link Between Worlds. They are identical. By the way, that shield borrowed heavily from the Hylian shield from Skyward Sword, except that these marks have 4 sides instead of 3, and this mark on the top has 2 parts instead of 3. Speaking of Cadence of Hyrule's cutscenes, the first one in the game indicates that the Triforce has pulled Cadence from her universe into this one, so that she may assist Link and Zelda, both of whom have been put under a sleeping spell by Octavo. Notice the first thing we see is the Triforce in its completed form, before any of the events of this game have occurred. This is very important. Contrast this with a game like Twilight Princess. In that game, the Triforce is not only split, but it resides within each of the 3 chosen characters, and it never reunites in that timeline. In Cadence of Hyrule, it does not split into 3 pieces until Octavo's deeds have wreaked their havoc. Only then does it do so in order to summon Cadence. The developers did an interview with Japanese website 4gamer.net, in which they explained how they were given specific instructions on how to handle the portrayal of the Triforce. They gave us very careful oversight regarding the representation and setting of the Triforce. We were told on very clear terms that they wanted this game to preserve the settings and mystical elements as they've been established for the series up until now. When Cadence first enters Hyrule, she holds up her hands and a golden triangle appears above the sleeping Zelda in order to break her curse. The fairy will remark that it looked like the Triforce, and that Cadence must really be special to wield such a power. Then in the final fight with Ganon, who evolved from the Gerudo named Ganondorf into the Beast Ganon only after obtaining Octavo's golden lute, Cadence, Link, and Zelda use the Triforce's power to seal Ganon. Not only that, but the game goes as far to indicate that all three heroes are holding pieces of the Triforce, including Cadence. This is in stark contrast to previous Zelda games where Ganon is in possession of the Triforce of power. But it is not entirely unprecedented, as the King of Hyrule in the Wind Waker was able to possess the Triforce and wish upon it. Or even the Triforce Keeper at the end of the Adventure of Link, who holds the Triforce of Courage. In the final battle, note what Ganon says to Link and the gang once they walk into his chambers. After Zelda says, "Link, we are here to help you," Ganon says, "Haha, so kind of you to bring the remaining pieces of the Triforce to me." It doesn't matter which player you were controlling at the time, or if you were playing co-op, this same sequence of dialogue will transpire. Ganon is speaking to Link, and he is referring to the other two pieces that are being held by the characters that follow Link into the room. Link has the Triforce of Courage, and the other two have the remaining pieces. It is my belief that Ganon does not have a piece of the Triforce. He only has the power of the Golden Lute. One of the magical characters will even tell you that his transformation was caused by the Golden Lute alone. This is a clue where Cadence of Hyrule falls on the Zelda timeline, one which we can use Zelda Encyclopedia once again to solve for. If we look for games that end with the Triforce being in its completed form, it fits my theory that Cadence of Hyrule takes place after A Link Between Worlds. The last time we see the Triforce before A Link Between Worlds was in the Oracle games where, after Link saves the day, it ascends to the sky before transforming into birds. The books tell us that after this, the Triforce splits, with pieces going to Link, Zelda, and the Ganon that remains sealed all the way back from the end of A Link to the Past. Then after Link defeats Yuga Ganon in A Link Between Worlds, the Triforce is returned to its completed form and laid to rest in the Hyrule Sacred Realm. We know that from the official timeline that the next appearance of the Triforce is when the royal family uses it to usher in Hyrule's golden era. Here's an excerpt from the Hyrule Historia book. Following the defeat of Yuga and the recovery of the Triforce, Hyrule entered a golden era of peace, in which great and wise rulers governed the land with the strength of the united Triforce at their command. I'm not entirely clear on how the Triforce went from this completed form in the Hyrule Sacred Realm to being wielded by the Hyrulean royal family, but this is canon and this is what happened according to multiple sources. Furthermore, the manual of the Adventure of Link depicts the king who wielded the Triforce during Hyrule's golden era, and he sure looks like the king from Cadence of Hyrule. Notice the red jewel on the crown, the white hair and the beard, the pointed ears and the red attire. By the way, he also looks like the kings from the Wind Waker and Minish Cap. But when the king from the Wind Waker ruled Hyrule, Link would not appear for many generations, not to mention everything is flooded in that timeline. As for the king from the Minish Cap, the Triforce is not part of that game's plot. Finally, in Cadence of Hyrule, once Ganon is sealed, during the end credits, the three heroes put their hands together and wish upon the Triforce in order to send Cadence back to her world. So, in conclusion, I believe Cadence of Hyrule takes place during the Golden Era, when the king used the Triforce for the prosperity of his land. When Octavo cursed his kingdom, the Triforce split, but only temporarily so that Cadence could save Link and Zelda, and then all three would be able to use it to reseal Ganon. The Triforce then returns to its completed state, and the very last shot of the game that we see is the Triforce whole again, where it will remain whole until the king during the Golden Era will move forward with the events described in the manual of the Adventure of Link. The king will realize that its power is too great and it must be divided. He sends the Triforce of Courage to the Great Palace, while the other two pieces stay with his children. In that manual, this king says the following: "Not everyone can use the Triforce. It requires a strong character with no evil thoughts, but an inborn special quality is also necessary. Unfortunately, I have not found such a person during my lifetime." Interestingly, even though you can play the game as Cadence, the game prevents you from speaking to the king as her, and he is still under Octavo's spell when the Triforce conjures Cadence to Hyrule, so he might not even be aware of her existence. And as far as the king knows, this Link is not worthy of wielding a Triforce piece either, as he appears to be defeated at the beginning of Octavo's reign. And perhaps it is the very events of Cadence of Hyrule that convinced the king to go from wielding the Triforce for the sake of Hyrule's prosperity to devising the scheme to split it up and hide the parts of it away. This would mean that, although Octavo failed in his fight against Ganon, his deeds inspired the king to do what is actually the best thing for Hyrule, and that decision turned out to be critical to the survival of Hyrule in future eras. There are a couple of reasons to believe my timeline placement is wrong. There is this mysterious line from one of the Sheikah fortune tellers, which I don't really know what to make of. But it certainly doesn't support my theory, and it could indicate I am missing some key plot point. Let's just assume they are talking about time travel in a general sense because of its massive impact on the Zelda series, and not some specific future event. Another issue is the Kokiri sword. You can obtain it in Cadence of Hyrule, and its description says the following: "Said to be intended for a future hero, this weapon was meant to banish anything in Link's path." The Kokiri sword first appeared in Ocarina of Time, which is the game that caused the whole timeline split. In other words, it occurs prior to my theory's placement. Maybe that description is saying that Cadence of Hyrule takes place before Ocarina of Time, perhaps in the Force era when the Minish Cap occurs. After all, the king from Minish Cap does look like the king from Cadence of Hyrule, but there are so many problems with this. Like, why would the Gorons evolve from this in Skyward Sword, to this in Cadence of Hyrule, to this in Ocarina of Time? Or where have all the Gorons gone for that matter? Or why are there suddenly Zoras, which are missing from the Force era? And why are there good and bad ones? Why does the Hylian shield look like one from the Downfall timeline? And finally, most importantly, if this occurs prior to Ocarina of Time, why is the Triforce not tucked away in the Sacred Realm where it was sealed in the eras preceding the Minish Cap? How could it escape the Sacred Realm without a breach like we've seen in previous games, only to return there where we've sealed it again in Ocarina of Time? Is the seal really that permeable? Perhaps the answer lies in the fact that during Ocarina of Time, the sword is merely a starter blade, and perhaps because the Link from that game makes it legendary, future wielders of it would be deemed heroes, and that is why we get such a lofty description after Ocarina of Time. Here's the description from Ocarina of Time. Kokiri's sword, a short blade suitable for a child. This sword is a treasure of the Kokiri. But this doesn't exactly fix my problem either, because the Kokiri sword-wielding Link from Ocarina of Time loses the fight to Ganon in the Downfall timeline, and because of this, he wouldn't necessarily be remembered as a hero. That would be more fitting for the child or adult timeline. So the best I can do with this whole Kokiri sword situation is hope that the sword is just legendary, and it will always be expected to be passed down to a hero, regardless of what has transpired in the future or the past. I saved the biggest problem for last, and that is the presence of the Gerudo in Ganondorf. To date, these desert dwellers have been largely missing from the Downfall timeline. Upon obtaining the Triforce, the Ocarina of Time Ganondorf loses his humanoid form and becomes the Beast Ganon, never to return to his Gerudo self again. After that, the only Gerudo in the Downfall timeline are the witches known as Twin Rova, and they are defeated at the end of the Oracle games. So if Cadence of Hyrule takes place where I think it does, how did the Gerudo suddenly appear after being missing since the Ocarina of Time days? Were they in hiding because they were ashamed in the role they played in the rise of the first Ganondorf? The events occurring in A Link to the Past are even more damning for my theory. Not only does the game manual say that Ganon himself vanquished his followers in his lust for the Triforce, but we know that all who enter the Dark World with Ganon are turned into monsters, and it's probable the Gerudo were with Ganon when he was sealed there. Thus, the Gerudo wouldn't appear as this benign tribe as they do in Cadence of Hyrule. My proposed answer to this problem lies in the fact that Hyrule Historia slightly retconned the A Link to the Past backstory. Instead of storming the Sacred Realm with his band of Gerudo thieves to obtain the full Triforce like the game manual explains, Ganon obtains the remaining 2 pieces from Zelda and Link by defeating them. Then Ganon gets sealed by the Ocarina of Time sages, presumably alone with the full Triforce, without his band of followers. In fact, the Gerudo in Ocarina of Time are in opposition to Ganondorf's behavior, with one of them even becoming a sage. Perhaps they did in fact flee their home to avoid the shame of Ganondorf, and Cadence of Hyrule is showing their brief return to Hyrule. Notice how temporary their houses and buildings appear. They look like half-built metal structures apparently still under construction, like shanties constructed out of scrap metal or whatever else they found laying around, like they were built yesterday. Even the Gerudo ruins are in this same style. This is in stark contrast to the Gerudo we have seen in other games, where they typically are surrounded by ancient stone temples, pyramids, and ruins, letting us know that they have been around since ancient times. So I believe these Gerudo left Hyrule for some adjacent land after the events of Ocarina of Time, returned to Hyrule during the events of Cadence of Hyrule, possibly under the direction of their new music-obsessed Ganondorf leader, only to flee again in shame once this new Ganondorf tries to steal the Triforce. And that explains why they are absent in The Legend of Zelda and Adventure of Link. This explanation would probably require the sealed spirit of Ganon to leave the Sacred Realm or wherever he is sealed away and inhabit the body of this new Gerudo Ganondorf. Otherwise, when this new Ganon is defeated, there would possibly be 2 Ganons sealed away at the same time, something that just doesn't feel right. I'm okay with this because it only requires the new Gerudo to act as a vessel for Ganon's spirit. After all, this is kind of similar to the mechanics of many other attempts at bringing Ganon back. Perhaps Ganon finally figured out a way to fully resurrect himself after those many failed attempts. So there you have it, folks. That's my theory for now. Thanks for watching, and please be sure to subscribe. Keep on groovin'.